Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thanks for joining us today. My name is Simone, and I'm community manager with the OED marketing team. And apart from welcoming you all today here, I'm going to be supporting our host and guest panel behind the scenes. And now, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Danica Salazar, who is going to present the newly launched OED Varieties of English site and is going to host the discussion panel. So, Danica, over to you.
Thank you, Simone. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, wherever you may be in the world. Welcome, and I'm truly delighted to be with so many of you today. We have a very interesting discussion coming up for you, but before that, I would like to start proceedings by formally launching and introducing to all of you the OED's Varieties of English pages. These web pages form a section of the OED's public website, and it's dedicated to different varieties of English spoken around the world and serve as a hub for the content and resources related to varieties of English on the OED site. And so you can see the URL of the page there. At the top of the Varieties of English landing page is a quote from a blog post by the OED's chief editor, Michael Prophet, in which he acknowledges that although the OED has always included words from across the English-speaking world, since the dictionary's first edition, the Anglophone population has grown considerably. 1.75 billion people worldwide can speak English to some useful degree, according to British Council estimates. As English speakers, we all share a common vocabulary. That's why it's possible for me to talk to you right now and for you to understand me. But it's also true that there are parts of our vocabulary that are specific to the variety or varieties of English that we speak. And that's largely determined by where we're from, where we live, and the linguistic communities that surround us. As our chief editor says in this quote, for the past few years, we have been undertaking a series of projects to improve our coverage of words and senses from those parts of the world in which English is used most prolifically and distinctively, so as to accurately and authentically document the diversity of English vocabulary. Now, if you're interested in the history of the OED's coverage of world varieties of English from the first fascicle published in 1884 to the current edition, and if you're also interested in the dictionary's current policies and procedures with regard to variation in English, the Varieties of English page also links to a blog post explaining all of that in detail. So I encourage you to read it, but for now, let me show you the Varieties of English pages. Okay, so the page can be accessed using this URL that you can see here. So after the two linked blog posts I have mentioned, the Varieties of English landing page features a table listing the varieties recorded by the OED. So you can see, if you scroll through the page, you can see it's quite a long list. So these pages are all a work in progress, and you will be adding more resource pages for each variety of English in the coming months. Where you can see a view resources link, that means the page for that variety is already available to view and you can click on it. After that, we have a Varieties in Focus section where we highlight the most recent updates to the OED, which right now are a batch of words of Korean origin and another of Caribbean English words, which we published in September 2021. We also mentioned here the work that's currently underway. We are revising and expanding the OED's coverage of African American English, Australian English, New Zealand English, and East African English. And our pronunciation team are developing a model for the transcription of Indian English, which we plan to publish this year. Okay, so now if you've ever thought, there's this word where I come from that needs to be in the OED, but it's not there. So here we have a solution for you. So you can go to this section where you'll find a submissions form to suggest a World English term for inclusion in the OED. All you need to do is to fill this in with your word or phrase along with the basic definition and other information. And your suggestion will be considered for possible addition to the dictionary. And you can even upload a sound file to let us hear how the word is pronounced. Yeah, and then click on submit and your suggestion will get to us. Next in this section is my face. Apologies, don't be alarmed. So this is a meet the editor's video with me talking about drafting dictionary entries for the many varieties of English spoken all around the world and how social media is helping inform our work. We also highlight in this section the external consultants we've worked with in our most recently published World English batches. So you can see that by clicking on the buttons over here. And then in this section, we provide links to information on pronunciation of different varieties of English that you can see on the OED's pronunciation pages. There's a link to a blog post by the OED's head of pronunciations, Catherine Sangster, explaining the transcription models that the OED's pronunciation team have developed to show the distinctive phonetic contrasts and patterns of several varieties of English recorded in the OED. These pronunciation models are used to provide the variety-specific phonetic transcriptions and audio recordings given for the OED's World English entries. Now, the next section is pretty self-explanatory. So here we give links to the most recent posts on the OED blog related to World Englishes. And then we have World English teaching resources. So in this section, we offer English language teachers a teaching activity pack with 3 lessons which they can use to introduce World Englishes in the English language classroom with the help of the OED. This is a freely downloadable resource that the OED developed in collaboration with 2 research partners in Singapore, ELT specialist and teacher trainer Sophia Khan of the British Council, and linguist and lecturer Dr. Yejong An of Nanyang Technological University. So if you just click through here, it will download the PDF and you can print that out, take it to the classroom. And the activities in these 3 lessons draw on OED Online's World Englishes content in order to help students to understand that English is a living, constantly evolving language, appreciate the validity of Englishes other than British and American, and explore how English is a global lingua franca, which is enhanced by diversity. So it's just a series of 3 lessons on these topics. Okay, so going back to the page, we have a section on World English publications where we provide links to academic research articles on World Englishes written by OED editors that have been published in research journals, edited book chapters, and online publications. And this ranges from a paper that I just published last year to an article published in 1987 about the new OED and World Englishes, with new referring to the 1989 second edition of the OED. So which really shows that we have been thinking about World Englishes for a very long time. And there's a section on World English webinars and events where you can find information about the OED's upcoming events and webinars, such as this one, related to World Englishes, as well as recordings from past events. Right now, we are featuring a webinar I gave in 2020 with our Nigerian English consultant, Dr. Kingsley Ugwuanyi, on World Englishes in the OED. There is also a section on COVID-19 and World Englishes, which features a recording of a webinar we did last year that combined insights from medical anthropology and lexicography to examine the impact the pandemic and similar public health emergencies have had on World Englishes and health communication. You can watch it there if you're interested in that topic. And we also link to Oxford Languages COVID-19 multilingual project, in which we offer freely downloadable translations of key COVID-19 terminology from English into 19 major languages spoken across the globe. Okay, just show you. So if you click there, you'll go to our COVID-19 language hub and you can go to this section and download. So if you're interested in translations to Afrikaans of COVID-19 terminology, you can download that resource. Okay, and then in this section, we feature the OED's collaborations with institutions on World English editorial projects. We are currently highlighting 2 of them: our partnership with Ontario Dialects Project on Canadian English, and with the Richard and Jeannette Allsopp Center for Caribbean Lexicography on Caribbean English. And in the news, we link to stories in the news media about the OED's coverage of World Englishes. Currently, we have several stories on the OED's Korean update, which was very, very popular and attracted a considerable amount of media attention late last year in South Korea and beyond. There are also news articles on work we did last year in Philippine English, Caribbean English, and Bermudian English. The media coverage includes not only interviews with OED editors, but also with our World English consultants, such as our Korean consultants, Professor Jiang Shin of Korea University and Professor Jian Kier of Oxford University, our Bermudian English consultant, Dr. Rosemary Hall, and our Caribbean consultant, Dr. Jeannette Allsopp. Finally, if you need any support at all, you can go to the help section to find a link to our help page or to contact us via email. Right, so that is the landing page. Now let's quickly look at a page for a specific variety of English. So if you, for example, click on the link for Philippine English, um, it will take you to a page with largely the same type of information, but for this particular variety of English. There is a link to an OED blog post with an introduction to Philippine English. So if you click there, you'll go to that introduction to Philippine English, detailing the varieties' lexical and grammatical features. So their vocabulary and grammar. There is a list of, and on the Philippine English page, there is a list of Philippine English words recently recorded in the OED, from borrowings from Filipinos such as bakya and bongga to distinctive uses of existing English words, such as the use of traffic as an adjective. Now, the words shown here are free to view, and if you would like to explore further but do not have personal or institutional access to the OED, you can get in touch with us to request a temporary access code. There's also a submission form for sending us suggestions for Philippine English words to add to the dictionary. So it's basically the same form as we had on the landing page. A link to a page listing the OED's consultants for Philippine English, links to our pronunciation model for Philippine English, and to posts on the OED blog about this variety. And if you go, say, to Hong Kong English, it's all pretty similar as well. The Hong Kong, it features an introduction to Hong Kong English from our consultant, Professor Kingsley Bolton, a respected scholar of Asian Englishes. We also provide a list of our consultants for the variety, past and present. So if you click through there, you can see a list of all the people that we've worked on in this particular variety, and including those linguists working on the varieties of Chinese that are the origin of the loanwords in Hong Kong English. And we also have held a webinar last year for Hong Kong, so we link to a recording of that here as well. So that's just a whistle-top tour of our new varieties of English pages. Please do feel free to explore the site. So you can see on this slide a list of the varieties for which we currently have active pages, but we will continue working to add more resources for more varieties in the coming months. So please do take a look, but not just right now, because right now we have something very interesting for you. So in the past few minutes, you've heard me mention several times the names of OED editors and World English consultants, without whose work and expertise or editorial projects on World Englishes would not be possible. Today, it is my honor and pleasure to be joined by a few of them to talk about a topic that is very relevant to the discussion of how English is used around the world. So please allow me to introduce them. So we have with us Dr. Jeannette Allsopp. She is retired senior research fellow in lexicography and founder and former director of the Richard and Jeannette Allsopp Center for Caribbean Lexicography at the University of the West Indies, which is home to the groundbreaking Dictionary of Caribbean English Usage, which celebrated its 25th anniversary just last year. She is a consultant of long standing for the OED, and we most recently collaborated with her on the OED's wide-ranging Caribbean English batch in the September 2021 update. We also have Dr. Rosemary Hall, research assistant on the Dialect and Heritage Project of the University of Leeds, and freelance World English researcher for the OED. She's also the dictionary's consultant on Bermudan English, the smallest variety to be recorded by the OED with an estimated 65,000 speakers, but also one of the oldest with a history stretching back to 1612. Also on the panel is my colleague on the OED, Dr. Catherine Sangster, executive editor and head of the dictionary's pronunciations team. In this role, she leads the OED's efforts to document the distinctive phonetic features of different varieties of English. Also joining us is Dr. Kingsley Ugwuanyi, English lecturer and researcher at the University of Nigeria and the OED's consultant on Nigerian English. He was closely involved in the OED's Nigerian English update early in 2020. And finally, we have with us Kelly Elizabeth Wright, PhD candidate in experimental social linguistics, University of Michigan, who is also on one of the African American English scholars contributing to the OED through the OED Researchers Advisory Group. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for being here. The title of our discussion today has three key terms. So we have language prejudice, documentation, and minoritized varieties. So let's look at first at this last term, minoritized. So we are using it and not minority because in linguistics, minority describes languages spoken by a small number of people, while minoritized languages or varieties of languages may have a large number of speakers, even it can even be millions of speakers, but are still marginal. But these are still marginalized in some way. So actually, my minoritization is more about power rather than numbers, and it can be quite direct and harsh. As in the outright banning of certain ways of speaking, but it's usually more subtle than that, but not any less harmful. So, for example, just to give you an example, when I came to this country, 10 years ago now, uh, to work as a postdoc researcher at the University of Oxford. It took a long time to get my visa because the UK wanted me to take the TOEFL to prove that I could speak English well enough to live and work here. And so there was, having spoken English all my life, speaking it every day at home with my PhD in English applied linguistics and a job offer from the University of Oxford to do research on the Oxford English Dictionary and being asked to take a standardized test to prove that I could speak English on an intermediate level. So it really, if you think about it, quite absurd. But why? Why does it happen? And because it's because the country I'm from, the Philippines, where English is an official language and an estimated 64 million people speak English. Is not considered by the Home Office as an English speaking country like, say, the US or Australia or Canada. So, yes, this is a form of a way of minoritization that, in my particular case, just cost me a minor inconvenience and an unnecessary expense, just taking an exam that I knew very well that I could pass. But for many others, this kind of thing, when it happens to them, they're not as lucky. So, how many people have been constantly ridiculed, lost job opportunities, or not believed in court just for the way they speak? So, there's the harm that we are talking about. So, I'd like to turn now to my fellow panelists and ask, what is your knowledge and experience of language prejudice? So, how have you experienced or observed it in your own community? You may have experienced it yourself or you may have seen it around you, and as linguists and lexicographers, how are you studying this? Let's start with so let's start with you, Rosie. What are your thoughts on this?
Sure. So hi everyone. It's great to be here. Um, I'm originally from Bermuda. I was born in Bermuda, and Bermuda's a place in the North Atlantic Ocean with a small number of speakers. Around 65,000 people live there, and it has a really interesting variety of English, a very old one, over 400 years old. And as in most language contexts, there's a certain tension in Bermuda between, on the one hand, language prejudice, negative attitudes about the dialect, and language pride, closely linked to personal identity, and very strong. And I should say at this point, I haven't personally experienced language prejudice in Bermuda because I'm not a speaker of Bermudian English, as you can probably hear. My parents were not originally Bermudian, and I've spent the largest proportion of my life living in the southern part of the UK, which actually makes me a very privileged speaker in that I speak something like a sort of standard Southern British English variety, which, interestingly, if you think about it, is actually a variety with a very small number of speakers, relatively. But while I haven't experienced language prejudice, I haven't been the subject of it, I've studied it a lot, because in my studies of Bermudian English, I looked very closely at dialect parody or dialect mocking, and the effect that can have.
Okay, Kelly, how about you? Thank you, Rosie. So Kelly, how about you? What is your background and how is your interest in language prejudice and how are you studying it?
Thank you. Yeah. So happy to be here. So my research is always centered on language prejudice. As a person of color, as a woman, as someone who grew up in Appalachia, my voice and my identity is central to how I move through the world. And so being othered by how I sound and how my body and positionality affect, my place in society is something that I always have to be aware of because the world makes that a reality for my existence. And so language has always been kind of central to my experience. And so my research started by looking at nationalism and how language is central to the product of creating national identity, our words for defining what a country is and how we build laws and our memory and institutions really affected me in a way that helped me understand, what language does in the world. And now my research looks at how the everyday negotiation of language and identity affects people over the course of a career. So I'm looking at the expression of Black professionalism and the ways in which social prejudices affect our daily negotiation of self through language.
Okay, I would just ask Kingsley for his thoughts.
I'm happy to be here. My name is Kingsley, and I've had a lot of experience, I would say, relating to language prejudice. And as Danica mentioned, I had a similar experience as Danica. And that was when in 2016, I was looking to begin my PhD. And one of the conditions, especially if, as I was looking at the US and the UK as well, was English language proficiency. And out of what I would call some personal pride, I said I wasn't going to write IELTS to prove to anybody that my English is good enough to be enrolled in a PhD program. And because most of the universities in the US that I was applying to insisted that TOEFL was an essential requirement, I said no. I said no. And then when I realized that a couple of universities in the UK could allow me to do my PhD without going through the rigors, what I call unnecessary rigors of writing IELTS or TOEFL, I immediately switched to the UK. And that was, maybe I would have preferred going to the US, but that was a huge factor for deciding where to go. And I remember another very experience in 2014, I think. I was looking to consult for the British Council in Nigeria and to be one of the examiners for IELTS. By then, the paper-based IELTS was still very popular. I don't know what it is now, particularly with COVID. I think everything is moving to online. So candidates would write exams. They have to be examined, assessed for the oral skills as well. So one of the conditions to examine for them was that I would have to write IELTS, and I would have to score 9 in each of the bands, and 9 is the maximum. And unfortunately, I couldn't get 9 in all of them, and that denied me that opportunity, I would say. But these are just some, but there could be many, many, many others. I mean, these are the ones I could remember now. But as Danica has said, how I've personally tried to approach this is to try to research into Nigerian English, into what it is, into its features, into how people approach it in terms of attitudes, because attitude is key to minoritized varieties of English. And that was what my PhD was focused on, in the broad area of attitudes of Nigerians towards their own variety of English. And a lot of things, a lot of interesting findings for that. Maybe I'll still find time to talk about that later. But this is one of the reasons why my relationship with the OED, when I discovered that they document varieties or minority varieties or minoritized varieties of English, it was something I was very excited. I remember one of the initial emails I sent to OED. I said, "This is something I'm so passionate about. I'm ready to give it my time, whether or not there is any kind of benefit going to accrue from that relationship, because it's something I'm passionate about. Because what the OED has been doing, or has been doing in a broader perspective now, is to give voice to these varieties of English that are minoritized. And we can see that is yielding something very, very big."
Thanks, Kingsley. Well, speaking of the OED, Catherine, could you tell us a bit more about yourself and your work on varieties of English in the OED? And also, you've done some research on British varieties of English as well, because although when we usually think of British English, we think of standard, received pronunciation. There is also a lot of variation within British English itself, within Britain, and there's so many other varieties of British English that can also be considered minoritized.
Yes, so yeah, as you, my own experience on my own research into prestige and less prestige varieties of English is definitely within the British Isles. My own sociophonetic research 20 years ago now was about Liverpool English, which is a variety of English within the British Isles, which is certainly experiences some prejudices of its own. But like Rosie, I'm a speaker of more or less standard Southern British English, apart from my Bath vowel, and so it's something that is not doesn't loom so large in my personal experience as in my research. So what we do now, in terms of creating the pronunciation models for the varieties of English, it's a piece of work that that we started in 2016 for in terms of the pronunciation specifically. We said, okay, well, every non-obsolete word that we have in OED has a British and, when revised, an American pronunciation. Let's make sure that the ones which have their origin in other Englishes have a pronunciation to match. So we had 10 World Englishes at first, which has risen to 14 now, with another 2 in the pipeline. And as you were showing the web pages, people can go there and see the models that we have, the keys that we have, and that's what we use to base the transcriptions on. I'll say a little bit now about how we go about building the models, and I'm happy to talk about that a bit more if people would like. So we define the variety that we're going to use. We look at all the research that's been done around that, recent sociolinguistic research from reputable sources. We compile a phonology for how how we're going to represent that. So we look at the consonants, the vowels, we look at the prosodic patterns, and that informs where we're going to put primary and secondary stress in the transcriptions. And then once we've made the transcriptions, we check them against actual recordings of speakers to make sure we haven't, we are representing things accurately. And then we publish the model, we use it to make the transcriptions that appear in the dictionary, and we keep it open for review. So I think one of the things I think is very important is to keep those models up there and invite feedback, and to think about questions like, well, we've grouped these varieties together for practical purposes, for lexicographical purposes. When does that become, at what point, for instance, is it helpful to look at Singapore and Malaysian English as a single model? At what point might we want to break those into two models? And to keep that dynamic and to keep learning and allowing ourselves to be informed. That's one of the things that underpins the work. Well, the work that we all do, but certainly what we do in the pronunciation.
Thanks, Catherine. So now that we're actually on the topic of pronunciations, that we should, I think it's a good idea to continue with it, because when we that's the first thing that people notice, when it comes to variation, it's people's accents. And sometimes, a lot of times when people talk about, English, as they're speaking about accents. And Kelly, you work in the fields of social phonetics and neurolinguistics, which I find very interesting. That you're taking a very very interesting experimental approach to how language production is perceived. So what are your thoughts on, why do you think what people are predisposed to be judgmental towards those who speak differently from them?
Yes, thank you. This is it's a very complex question, but it's one of my favorites to get, right? So our voices are very tied to our identities, right? They're really a product of geospatial and temporal reality, right? And so we create linguistic stereotypes in our minds, and they're really the products of patterns of oppression that predate the printing press, right? And so people who have heard me present my work or read my work have seen that phrase many, many times from me. And so when we start to think about the types of language that we call proper, or that we say sounds pleasing to the ear, right? Or that we want to label as appropriate, right? For certain venues or for certain forms of address, or we feel, just is better in some mouths than others, or what kinds of language is legal, right? None of that falls out of the natural evolution of a linguistic system, right? That is the product of the reality of social control, right? So who has been in control? The able-bodied, the moneyed, and men, right? And for most of written history, those able-bodied, moneyed men were mostly white and mostly Christian, right? So those influences have predisposed us to liking the kinds of voices and language that we like, right? It is the material and social history of the world that influence us in this way, right? That influence the functional organization of our individual linguistic systems, right? The individual ways that we must construct and conduct our identities through these systems. And so it's actually a quite profound question of asking why we are predisposed this way, because in fact, every living human being is affected by language prejudice, because we can't separate ourselves from the influence of text, and we can't separate ourselves from how language as an involved system that is part of our biology is influenced by like social history. Yeah, so it's something that we all need to confront. And it's and that like that fact, like the language and society are like intimately connected, is the central like driving factor in my experimental research. So I try to keep that assumption in the middle of the questions that I ask and bring into the lab. And it's actually very fascinating. So yeah, I will just like slide that nugget in for us all to kind of chew on later.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point that you bring up, Kelly, because like growing up in the Philippines, when we started to become a bit more conscious about the discrimination that we face in our use of English, sometimes there's also a lot of victim blaming happening, saying, oh, it's just you're not nationalistic enough. You know, why do you want to have that American accent? But of course we do, because it's all like it's hundreds of years of colonialism and history, and that, you know, that has an impact on how people perceive themselves. And there's really, you know, and it's not just about how we feel about our countries and ourselves that influences that. um, and also it's really interesting. I remember some you know, working in the OED a lot, when people hear that you know, I'm a lexicographer, I mean, usually they think, oh, the OED, oh, I love dictionaries, I love words. And then they proudly announce to me that they're grammar Nazis. And and I hear someone said, a speaker at a conference that I attended once said that, isn't it funny that that's the one thing where people almost seem proud to say that they're grammar Nazis, is when it comes to policing language and making um, and somehow language is one of the few places now where you can be classist and racist and sexist and have people think it's okay. And usually that and very often that's covered, you know, that's uh, communicated through humor. And it happens so often that we even have a term for it, you know, dialect parody. And Rosie here on the panel has actually done some research on that. So Rosie, can you tell us more about dialect parody? What is it, and how has it affected the way that Bermudan English and perhaps other varieties of English have been perceived?
Sure. So to put it simply, dialect parody is basically doing an impression, or putting on a variety of a language in order to mock that variety for the purposes of humour. Now, I'll wager that everyone here has heard somebody do this, has heard somebody impersonate a dialect of English. It happens all the time. It's an extremely common feature of stand-up comedy, for example. And I think a lot of the time, this type of dialect impression is thought of as just a bit of fun and relatively harmless. And in fact, that's actually what makes it so insidious, is that if you were to question an instance of dialect parody or somebody making fun of an accent, you're very probably going to get told that you have no sense of humor. So in a way, it's quite a safe, almost like a protected way to express prejudice, because it's very, very popular and very, very common. And you can always accuse people of not having a sense of humor if they don't laugh at your joke. In fact, no variety of English is objectively funny. All varieties of English are combinations of pronunciations, words, grammatical structures that are equally linguistically valid. And people who study language for a living know this, but unfortunately, the myth that some varieties are better than other varieties is deeply, deeply, deeply ingrained in English-speaking societies in particular, as Kelly was saying. And dialect parody really reinforces this idea. It's important always to look deeper, look more closely at a piece of dialect parody to ask what's really being made fun of. And often it's not just about making fun of a variety or the way it sounds or the words, it's making fun of speakers of that variety. And what happens there is that stereotypes that are usually crude and harmful are being perpetuated. sometimes in a sort of covert way, and like I said, a sort of safe way that we don't always pay attention to. So think for a moment about the type of character that's being painted when somebody makes fun of a dialect, whether that's words or pronunciation. And 9 times out of 10, especially if it's a so-called non-standard variety, that character has undesirable qualities. They are unintelligent, they may have alcohol addiction, they may be presented as being lazy. And so you start to see this kind of stereotype being attached to a way of speaking that's incredibly dangerous. Now, I have to say, this is not always the case. Of course, there are lots and lots of different types of linguistic performance. People do it for all sorts of different reasons, and there's plenty of sort of nuance that happens. But linguists have found again and again that dialect parody is an easy proxy for race and class-based discrimination. And this is what I found to be the case in Bermuda during my PhD research. Like I said earlier, I grew up in Bermuda, and I'm sad to say that making fun of Bermudian English is a favourite pastime among white people in Bermuda. It's not often talked about so bluntly, but as a white person who's lived in Bermuda on and off many times, it's often the subject of dinner table hilarity. It's a very popular pastime. It also happens on stage. And my PhD research looked into this type of dialect parody and basically showed that it's part of a very common phenomenon around the world of privileged groups generalizing about disempowered groups and then appropriating their language for a type of social gain. So of course there's an extreme double standard going on here. If you're white in Bermuda and you make fun of a Bermudian accent, you're rewarded with status, kudos, people laugh, enjoy your joke, they think you're good at it. And on the other hand, if this is your everyday variety that you use in Bermuda, you may well be subject to workplace bullying. I actually did a study on white bosses making fun of their black employees and the way they speak through humour. Very, very common. Or you might be subject to discrimination that in fact eventually affects your access to things like jobs and housing. And I think probably to sum this up really well is a tweet from 2020 by a Bermudian, and it read, hashtag being black in Bermuda. That's an important hashtag in the Bermudian community. Being black in Bermuda is hearing white foreigners mock our accent, both on the streets and in meetings. So I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so it's really, really striking because although, as you said, that it's always just dismissed as, you know, dinner table hilarity, it's something that's very insidious. I mean, even if you just think about that stereotype of the uneducated, you know, speaking bad English. I mean, if you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. A person who was able to acquire two languages at the same time, uneducated, unlearned, it doesn't make any sense. But it's these kinds of myths and prejudices that are mostly perpetuated through jokes, through humor that can, you know, lead to quite lasting harm. Well, now, and that's why a lot of people, and I mean, a lot of places, like in where I grew up, for instance, in the Philippines, like when you go to school or you go to university, everything that doesn't align to the standard and that could you know, expose you to this kind of ridicule is totally eradicated, and that has a lasting influence on the educational system and what kinds of forms of languages are taught in schools. So I'd like to turn now to Kingsley to talk more about this because, you know, Kingsley, you are coming to this panel from more of an applied linguistics perspective, and I was just and I just wanted to ask you, you know, how do you think that the predominance of prestige, because I think our situation is kind of similar, because like in the Philippines, in Nigeria, although in the Philippines it's more the American English that is the exonormative variety there. In Nigeria it's more of British English, and in a lot of other post-colonial countries around the world. Do you think has the predominance of prestige varieties of English, such as standard British or American English, have affected the way that English is taught in Nigeria, and how has that in turn impacted Nigerians' perception of and ownership of Nigerian English, which has been the topic of much of your research?
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much, Danica. I would begin by lifting a quote from one of the participants in my PhD research, who said that it conflicts. It here, I mean, trying to use the word for word, it conflicts with what we are taught in the classroom. That is Nigerian English. It there refers to, and this was this participant was talking about the model of the pedagogical model used in teaching English in Nigeria. Of course, as Danica has rightly said, the pedagogical model for teaching English in Nigeria is still pretty much outward looking in terms of towards British English models, because you look at the curriculum, you look at even the pronunciation model, you find that in the exams, Nigerians students are still expected to write phonology-related exams that actually mirror British English. But you find that most students say that this is pretty much far away from what they know, from what they use all the time. So there is some kind of tension, I would say. And this tension has been in research associated with the massive failure in English, so that most students, what they go to exams to write is pretty much different from what they are familiar with in their everyday language usage. Because most of these people speak Nigerian. Not only do they speak Nigerian English, they are taught by Nigerian teachers of English who themselves use and they know only Nigerian English. But when it gets to exams, in classroom exams or external exams, they are tested based on a different model, a different expectation. And there is a lot of confusion about this. And it was a very popular scholar in Nigerian English context, known as Ayo Bamboshe, said that this is to be seen particularly in the divergence between actual use and the norms sanctioned by examining bodies. So while even the examiners themselves, according to Bamboshe, use non-native English norms, non-native is a term I increasingly find difficult to use. I mean, it keeps appearing in literature, right? Because even in my research, I stumbled, some participants identified as native speakers of English. And one of the participants said, well, I'm not a native speaker of English, but English is my first language. And you find, because some of these terms are ideologically loaded, you find that participant was saying, that speaker was saying, well, when you talk about native language, I tend to think about the language of my community. But it happened that this speaker is an English only speaker. I mean, doesn't speak any other Nigerian language apart from English. And talking about the identity, these ones, how they identify themselves, it becomes a little controversial. And I was trying to, that was just a bit of distraction. I was trying to paraphrase as much as I can what Bamboshe said. Said even while the examiners themselves use non-native English norms, they are forced by syllables and textbook requirements to reject such norms. Hence, West African examiners in English, there's this general English examining body in West Africa known as WAEC, West African Examination Council. They reject such norms as furnitures, equipment, discuss about, simply because the only sources of codification available do not sanction the use of such expressions. Their sources are in turn the sources in turn are based on standard native, read British English norms. How then, and this is a question that is very critical to to what I do. How then can local norms, how then can Nigerian English norms become established if they are discouraged in education? Because we know that education is very, very pedagogical practices and models. They tend to hold a potential implication for how language users perceive themselves, their identity, and their ownership of the language they speak, right? Because classroom practices are likely to influence how students perceive the social status of the language being taught. And we know this. So in today's Nigeria, so that this divide is there. Researchers, particularly Nigerian English researchers, believe that there's been a full textbook model of phonology of Nigerian English, for instance, which was designed and with pedagogy in mind, published as far back as 2010, right? I've just forgotten the name of the author, right? But when this is what it seems that the researchers are on the one side, while the policymakers and examiners are the other side of the spectrum. So it's while the students suffer in between, so to speak. So it is still the examiners, the policy, of course, still refers to English monolithically without no reference to an indigenous variety or so. So there is that tension, particularly in the classroom, between the local norms and the exonomatic variety of norms or models of British English in the Nigerian classroom, I would say. Yeah.
Thank you, Kingsley. And then also, I mean, your stories take me back even to my own experience of in education in the Philippines. And it just strikes me now, like how much time was spent just obsessing on little, if you think about it, very inconsequential questions of grammar and pronunciation, being told, you have to say it apple, not apple, as they would say in the Philippines, how many times is this constant drilling and also this obsession with the purity somehow of language, this obsession with the monolithic ideal of a standard English, which in a country with so much linguistic diversity is really impossible. It's just like what you're saying, Kingsley, that it's like the world of the classroom is so removed from the world that pupils exist in, where you have students who live in a very much multilingual society being forced to conform to monolingual norms uh, and then forcing purity in people who are used to having more than one language, who are used to what we call code switching. So I'm sure, like in a place like Nigeria, where there's so many languages being spoken, it's just shifting from one language to another depending on who you're talking to or what you're talking about. That's just how you are. That's just the default. People are not even aware that you're doing it. So in fact, in the Philippines, if the standard the way of the people speak generally in everyday life is not either English or Filipino. It's Taglish. It's just a mix of both, and people just change. And code switching is a very specific kind. When we're using that term to mean the changing from one linguistic code to another, it's something. It's a phenomenon that's so common, and that in a world where there are and what we often don't realize is that there are more multilingual people in the world than there are monolingual ones. So multilingualism actually is the norm, not the exception. And it's this constant negotiation between linguistic codes, between languages, is an essential skill. But for some reason, we value more, language purity and this monolithic standard, and that's just quite a contradiction, really. And it's when it's something that's so natural, even Robert Burns used to do it, switching between English and Scottish all the time, and it's something that comes so natural to so many people, but it's just something that's looked at quite negatively. Although now, thankfully, as people are becoming much more conscious of diversity and identity, that the previously denigrated hybrid varieties of English, such as, let's say, Singlish or Taglish or Hinglish, are increasingly being valued and being used to create works of literature and art and music. So I think we are somehow going in the right direction there. But for me, from the perspective of a lexicographer and an historical lexicographer, code switching can quite complicate the task of documenting the English varieties of English, because especially since in the OED, whenever we're working on a word, we have to go back to the very earliest evidence of the word being used in English. And sometimes it makes it very difficult for us. It is very difficult for us to see, like, whether a Nigerian English word that's a borrowing, let's say, from Hausa or Yoruba is an if the earliest example that we found is an actual example of usage in English, or if it's just an example of a person code switching and that's just like a one-off. But actually that's also a good thing, because working on World Englishes somehow makes us lexicographers kind of re-examine our processes and policies when it comes to working on different varieties of English, because instead of just looking at a very monolingual sort of language, we're seeing so much more diversity. So we kind of have to re-examine, okay, what does constitute good evidence for the OED? So that's why we think it's such a good thing for us to be doing so much more work on different varieties of English. But I still would like to stay on the topic of dictionaries, since we're talking about, so we're now going to our other keyword, which is documentation. So well, I don't know what Jeannette would have said, but as a lexicographer working on varieties of English, there are certain challenges to documenting them in a dictionary, because so one of them, of course, is the shortage of available evidence. You have experience of this, Rosie, working with a variety as small as Bermudan English. Sometimes there are words, we use that in our variety, but you can't find written examples, because they're all like, it's usually just used in spoken language. And the OED as a historical dictionary relies a lot of printed sources, because it's very important for us to dates are very, very central to the OED. You want to know, you can't just say, oh, my grandmother said that, over dinner 25 years ago. You have to have some kind of evidence of when and where, when a word is used. So, but now, thanks to technology, we are more and more texts from different parts of the world are being digitized and are becoming available to us from wherever we are in the world. And social media as well is becoming increasingly important for us in documenting varieties of English, because places like Twitter, for example, is very interesting, because it's a written medium. So if we're looking for dates, you can find dates on Twitter. You can even see the very hour and second something is posted on the site. But people tweet usually much more the way they speak rather than they write. So it's kind of like this hybrid kind of language register that we didn't used to see before. So being able to have access to this kind of written, spoken language just gives us so much more evidence. So, for example, talking about that entry for traffic being used as an adjective in Philippine English. So in the Philippines, we say, oh gosh, it's so traffic here during rush hour. So we added that to the OED. We tried to add that to the OED years ago, but we couldn't, because we couldn't find any evidence of it being used at all. But then when we started using Twitter, suddenly we had an abundance of evidence to quote. So having all of these new sources of evidence really is opening up new avenues of research for us. But the question is, though, why do we bother? Like, why? So this is a question I want to pose to everybody. Why? Because dictionaries have always, the other thing about dictionaries is that it's always been at least perceived by people to be the instrument for perpetuating a monolithic idea of language, so perpetuating the standard. You know, it's what tells it's the thing that tells you what is correct and what's not, right? At least that's how people generally think of dictionaries. But then why do you think it's important for varieties of English to or or varieties of English that are previously they're generally minoritized or marginalized? Why is it important for them to be documented in dictionaries such as the OED? Rosie, did you have any thoughts?
For me, the best way to describe the OED is the story of language. And why would you write a story and leave out, half of the chapters? It really doesn't make sense. And I think also representation. If you open a dictionary and you want information about a word that you're hearing, then you need to be able to find words from all of the many world Englishes, and not just from one or two varieties. Otherwise, it's not a very useful dictionary.
So Kingsley, you've kind of touched on that a little bit earlier as well. So what do you think? What is the significance of seeing Nigerian words in dictionaries such as the OED?
Well, it cannot be gainsaid that OED has prestige and the international outlook. I'll just tell you a story. Now, OED just added less than 30 Nigerian English words in 2020. But before then, there have been about 4 dictionaries of Nigerian English published locally, one published in German, in Germany rather. And some of the ones published had thousands of words, right? But the inclusion of just about 29 words had more attention, attracted more attention, got more people talking about it. And this, in my opinion, is associated with the prestige that the OED has. So particularly for teachers, right? And for developing indigenous models for teaching, it's easier because most teachers of English today continue to rely and defer to dictionaries. Growing up in Nigeria, most times when teachers teach in secondary school, you say, so this is not in the dictionary, is it in the dictionary and all that? So people usually, and Oxford, in my own opinion, seems to be one of the most popular, if not the very most popular. So this is very, very important that these is being expanded. So it's going to give voice to, as I mentioned earlier, to these minoritized varieties and pave way for the creation of standardized varieties of this English. For instance, when 2020 the OED added Nigerian English words, one of the debates in the public, especially in social media, is okay, if students write this in exams, for instance, embamons, that's one of my favorite words added. Embamons, referring to the last 4 months of the year considered together as one period, one very busy period, October, November, December, September, October, November, December, right? So if students write this way, then what will they be accepted in the classroom? And I remember one of the national dailies granting me interview asked me this particularly, now that the OED has begun to add Nigerian English words in the OED. Now, do you encourage students to write this way, to write in Nigerian English in exams? And I said they have to do so with caution because while this is that, so many teachers will still not continue to accept that, right? And or will not accept that. And then they need to pass. These students, they need to pass the exam, which is very key. Their parents want them to pass. They also want to pass to progress. But also there's that excitement that my linguistic identity is being represented. So that continues that tension which I referred to initially. But it is the beginning. The most important thing is that OED created a space for this debate, for this discussion to take place. And I believe that it is just an iceberg to what is going to come. Yeah.
Yes, I believe so too. Kelly, what are your thoughts? Why is representation in reference resources so important for minoritized varieties of a language?
Yeah, I mean, this is a project that is really very near and dear to my heart. So it's like, how can I talk about it without crying? It's I mean, as I started talking about, like, the people of color have been kept out of all official processes of meaning making, again, for the entire history of print. So really, any effort to involve those communities in documentation is really actually liberation. It's incredibly important, and it's really difficult to overstate, to be hyperbolic about it. So it's incredibly important. And just to give you an anecdote from my research, these interviews that I'm doing now with Black professionals include a section where I walk them through a list of terms that arise from African American language and ask them to tell me, like, what do they mean? How do you use this term? It's like a metalinguistic interview. And I go through like a long list, and I get to this word in the middle, and one of my interviewees stops and says, like, what's wrong with this? Like, I asked them about what had happened was. Tell me what had happened, what that means. And she's like, what's wrong with that? We're in the middle of the interview. And I'm like, what's wrong with that? Nothing's wrong with any of these words. What do you mean? And she's like, well, Finn is not a real word. And I'm like, yeah, it is. It's in the dictionary. Not that makes that a real word, but the OED put this in the dictionary. And she was like, no, what are you talking about? I literally stopped what I was doing, pulled it up, showed her. She started to cry. Like, this was something like, are you serious? Like, my actual language, are you serious? Like, it's in the most official thing I could ever think of, the Oxford English Dictionary, like not even Webster, hate him, not even Webster, not even, right? Like the Queen's English, like the real dictionary, like take every language ideology you've ever heard, like put all the most dangerous things like that we are trying to work against. But that's the thing, is like, it matters to see these words. Like, it is healing for communities to see their language in print in this way. So it's like, yes, we want to challenge prescriptivism. Yes, we want to resist standard language ideologies that say you put something in a dictionary and that makes it real. You put something in the dictionary and that's its meaning forever and it's stable, and this was the only way people said it. But when you see what it does for people when they see their language represented in that way, I'll never stop doing it. I'll never stop encouraging people to, everyone who's listening to this right now, like, you're asking how to get involved, think about the words that you use and go type them into those forms. Record your own voice saying them. Spend as much time as you possibly can trying to get your own experience represented in this form, because these people who are here are invested in making sure that they have the richest and fullest representation of the English language. And that involves every space that it has touched in the world for the history of time. And we have never had the opportunity to do that in the way that we do now, right? With the entire connected globe, with recordings, with TikToks, with all these things that we're talking about, with all these ways that people are making meaning. We've been doing this since the beginning of time, but we've never been able to capture it. We've never been able to study it. We've never been able to think about it. It is really fantastic and challenging. And it's just, you see, I'm getting worked up. And so, yeah, I really, from my heart, come to this from the place of just the biggest nerd who wants just to look at it. I just want to see the language, right? And so for me, that's like, let's get it. Everybody start talking, start thinking, send it in, because it isn't complete until we have it all, right? And so let's fill the gaps in, and the gaps are from all of us who have never been here from the very beginning. All right. So it's really important. And the people who are here are taking it super seriously.
Yeah. Well, I think
Thank
you
you.
might start getting me worked up as well. So that's a really touching validation of the work that we do. What do you think about it, Catherine? As an OED colleague.
I mean, it's yeah. I don't think I have anything to. I think that is such a profound point. There is a question. One of the questions in the chat, Sondos Bauker has asked a question which opens: how much work is being done to tackle the appropriation of the OED as a tool of language prejudice? And I feel like the answer to that question is to stop it being a tool of language. A kind of swords into plowshares type scenario where you say, okay, well, if this is incomplete, as Kelly says, if this is not the full picture of what English does, whether it's in terms of the words that are represented, the syntactic nature of those words, or the pronunciation of those words, then we're not doing our whole job if we're not reflecting all of this. And the way to kind of declaw the use of something like the OED as like Kingsley was talking about earlier in educational contexts. And yeah, I really recognize that tension that Kelly mentioned as well between simultaneously not wanting to uphold those, oh, well, if it's not in the dictionary, it's not codified. Those things are not unproblematic, but at the same time, let's put these things in the dictionary, and then they're in the dictionary, and people can give them the appropriate, can respect them, can point to them, can say whether they're saying, here is the way I say something, and look, it's right here. I mean, that's our whole enterprise. That's what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, and I also just wanted to say that, I love that we're talking about the OED. We love the OED, but as great a dictionary as it is, it's not the be all and end all of lexicography. And that's why it's such a shame that Jeannette has had problems, because she comes to us, to this panel, with 25 years of experience working on a dictionary of Caribbean English, which gives you exactly the same kind of information that you can get in the OED, the same historical information, the same rigorous methodology, but specifically dedicated for the Englishes of the Caribbean. And because the thing with the OED is that there's only so much, dictionaries are made by humans. There's only so much time during the day. There are only so many editors that are working in the dictionary, and it's a dictionary that's covering all of English throughout 1,000 years of history. So there's only so many words that you can put in the dictionary. But the other thing that we want to do is to support dictionary projects like the DCEU, like we have had a long relationship with dictionaries like the Dictionary of South African English, the Australian National Dictionary. So all of these dictionaries, they're specifically dedicated to these minoritized varieties of English, so that its very speakers can create dictionaries of their own. It doesn't always have to just go through the OED alone. So if there's anything that we can do to encourage that, more research into these varieties, more dictionaries, more resources, more, we're all big nerds here. We want more thesauri, more of that stuff. We don't have to have just one dictionary. It always strikes me as so funny when someone comes up to me and say, "Oh, I love the OED. I have it sitting on my desk since 1989." I'm like, that doesn't make me happy. If you're still looking at the OVD of 1989, that means you have not seen anything of my work. I mean, so, we have to create more resources, because, I feel like if I ever see a dictionary of Philippine English in print, it's gonna be, I'm going to weep, because that's what we need, more research and more resources, and more dictionaries, so that we can see the words.
Hello, are you
Hello,
hearing
hi
me?
Jeanette. So happy to finally
Oh my
to be
goodness,
able
I've
to
had
hear
the
you.
most
So,
awful time,
and
and I
actually
don't
just
know,
in time. So what? Maybe you
I
could
don't
just
know
give.
why this has happened, because when I came in,
Yeah,
everything was perfect, but from the time you
yeah,
turned us off or turned off our cameras, I never got back in. So I'm sorry about that, and I'm sorry that because I've been fiddling with the computer and my daughter's been helping me, I've missed a lot of the discussion on the lexicography part of it.
yeah. Well, I guess we just wanted to ask you to comment on how, in your experience with editing the DCEU, like how did you think that having this dictionary for Caribbean English, how has that impacted, the way that the Caribbean English has been perceived, and why is it important to have something like the Dictionary of Caribbean English Usage? What, at the very beginning of the project, because it was so new and so groundbreaking, what made you want to create it, and what do you think the impact has been of the dictionary in the Caribbean in the past 25 years?
Okay, those are several questions. I'll start off with the fact that when the dictionary was conceived by Richard Allsopp, he was seeing it as a way to document, first of all, before we get to Caribbean English, he was seeing it as a way to document the Guyanese variety of English. Because when he was a student at University College London and undergrad, he had actually had an experience where his English was questioned, and that did not go down very well. So it led him, the sentence in question that he said was, for the rain had stopped or the rain had ceased. He said the rain had held up. And he was wrongly taken to task by his tutors. And then later on, because he was a student of French, he used to go over to France for the summers. He said something similar in France and was also wrongly taken to task. So then he realized that the Guyanese variety of English was different from the British variety, and he started documenting. And that was fine. That was his own way of responding to, as a teacher, because he was a teacher of French. And of course, in those days, everybody wrote British exams, whether it was London or Oxford and Cambridge. And so he wanted to be sure that his students in their translations, etc., were using, correct English, standard English, and so on and so forth. So he collected all this stuff through surreptitious recordings, which would be politically incorrect now, and put them in on cards in shoe boxes. And then later, when he was leaving Guyana permanently to go to the University of the West Indies, he took them with him and found that because there were students from all over the Caribbean at the University of the West Indies, Cave Hill campus in Barbados, he could get inputs on English from all over the English speaking Caribbean. So that is how the Dictionary of Caribbean English Usage came about. Now, in terms of whether it was seen as something, as a useful instrument, is another matter, because most people said, well, we don't understand why there has to be a dictionary of Caribbean English, because we have been speaking English from the time we are born, which is not true. You've been speaking not standard British English, you've been speaking a Caribbeanized variety of English. And of course, there are also the Creoles and the dialects of the Caribbean, which are spoken by the majority of Caribbean English speakers. So there was that hurdle, why a dictionary of Caribbean English usage, which he tried to explain. And people felt, well, we've got the OED, we've got the Oxford, we've got the Pocket Oxford. Why do you want to have this dictionary? And so he had to explain that what he was doing, that's why it's called the Dictionary of Caribbean English Usage, that what he was doing was recording um, the way in which language is used, and it didn't matter what kind of language it was, except for, of course, language that is really sort of stigmatized or, unpleasant. So he pointed out that he was recording, because the dictionary not only prescribes, it describes. And he did try to do both in the dictionary, because he came up with the idea of status labeling, where the speakers themselves were contributing to how their varieties of English were seen. And so, what was not particularly acceptable by the general public, especially the educated public, was labeled with different status labels. There was formal, anti formal, informal, which were sort of less rigidly um, acceptable on the standard level. And then there was anti-formal mixed with Creole, anti-formal mixed with jocular, anti-formal mixed with um, derogatory, because of course there was also derogatory language. But at the same time, he was recording. So in his in the DCEU, which I contributed to as well, you have these status labels, and they're in italicized square brackets to show how the item is perceived. So that was a a big hurdle, but many people didn't understand it. And of course, although the dictionary was supposed to be a teaching tool, many teachers are not linguists. And that's what we've been trying to do in the Department of Linguistics at University of the West Indies, Cave Hill, that is trying, and not only at Cave Hill, but at the other campuses as well. We've been trying to get teachers to understand that they need to have some kind of linguistic training in order to grasp the kind of language situation that they're grappling with. Because what you will get is that ministries of education in the Caribbean will say, oh, you cannot speak non-standard English in school at all. It has to be standard English. There's very few people who speak standard English. Even the teachers don't speak standard English, and they don't realize it. They speak a Caribbeanized variety of English, which is understood across the family of world Englishes, because structurally it is much the same, but in terms of lexicon, regionalisms, etc., it is not. So there was all that came into play. And so the dictionary was compiled. It was recognized as something very useful. But the thing about the DCEU is that it is so linguistically sophisticated that very many people who are non-linguists can't use it. I mean, you can read it in a sense because some of the definitions are quite jocular and humorous, but you really wouldn't understand. It starts off, for example, with 20 superscripts of the letter A in Caribbean English. Who's going to understand that? No teachers are going to understand that. No teachers are going to understand when you talk about misascription, or you talk about the something like the epenthetic consonant in tambrin, which is originally tamarind, but phonologically and for ease of pronunciation, an epenthetic B is put in the middle of the word. People generally do not understand that. So in looking at it and in revising our opinions of it, we realize that we need to have a school dictionary, a school edition of the DCEU. And that is what I've been working on over the past, I would say, 6 or so years. It's now in press at the University of the West Indies Press in Jamaica. And so I've been very busy recently reading the first proofs and so on and so forth. But what I have done is rewritten the dictionary, taken out all the things like the 20 superscripts of A, and I've even taken out things like the pronunciation, because no teacher, no regular English teacher knows what IPA is or can use it. So took out that, took out the things like the status labeling and so on, and just made it more or less a fairly basic entry with a head word, the part of speech, the territory, because it's very important to label it territorially because we don't all use the same things. There's a lot of cross referencing that goes on in the DCEU. And given the definition, simplified the definition, and also included where possible and where it could be easily understood some etymological information at the end of the entry, and maybe a special note indicating the usage. For example, in Barbados, The main police station is called the Main Guard. And I've never seen that used in any other English speaking territory in the Caribbean. So you have a note there saying why it's called that, and a little bit about the historical significance of that with the British regiments that were there and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of things that have to be considered in dictionary making. And to answer your question about its impact after 25 years, the impact is nowhere as great as neither my husband or I would have liked to have seen. I have been able to use it to formulate courses from undergraduate level to PhD at UWI campus, using the dictionary as a as one of the main texts, and using my own multilingual dictionary because I've worked with Caribbean English, French, Creole, and Spanish on my own, using those two dictionaries as the basis for the courses, introducing lexicography at undergrad level, saying what it's about, why it's important, and emphasizing its cultural aspects. It's not just something that you look up words in. It tells your linguistic, cultural, and your it gives your identity. It gives you the history of your language and your culture, and through that, it gives you your identity within the world. And so, after that, after those basic courses, then I did an MA, wrote up an MA course, and I have some graduates who are MAs in lexicography, and then an MPhil, which is the intermediate degree between MA and PhD, and I have like about 3 PhD graduates who have done very well, but who are not really, in a sense, able to use their lexicography because they have not come back into the center to work. They have one is probably right now being named a minister of something because we just had elections in Barbados yesterday. And my star student who got a distinction in his PhD is in the Ministry of Education. So it's quite possible that he's the parliamentary secretary in the Ministry of Education, which is the person next to the minister. It's quite possibly he will be able to either move up or something. I don't know. But the thing is to get people to understand why it is so necessary, not just for a job, but for your whole being, for your linguistic identity, your cultural identity. You understand how your language evolved, why it evolved the way it evolved. You get a good idea of your history because, of course, the history of Caribbean English is languages in contact. Hundreds of West African languages in contact with standard British varieties, which were not always south of England varieties. So there is that as well. But the whole thing is very complex, and I would say that I am hoping that with the publication of the school edition, the original dictionary will be more recognized. Some people don't even know about it. It's 25 years old. Some people don't know about it. That's the way it is. But we have to keep working. We have to keep working. I am hoping that I'll be able to train a few more people to understand fully what is Caribbean English and how to document it and why it needs to be documented. And I am also hoping that when I pass off the scene, the work will go on. Mhm.
Many thanks for your wonderful contribution to the panel discussion. And I just want to say I'm very sorry again that we could only get you back on with audio. And I'm very sorry to interrupt. We could just stay here listening to you for the rest of the evening. But we need to move on to take some questions from the audience because we've got lots of questions coming in.
Of
So I hope
course,
you
of
don't
course.
mind. I'm going
No,
to
not at
pass
all.
it back on to Danica so she can start choosing some of the questions.
Right. So I'm aware that we're running out of time, but there are loads of questions. I've just been reading through them, and I think there are some common themes for the questions. I will just try to synthesize them all, okay, into 2 or 3 that we can address, because otherwise we'll be staying here until tomorrow. I think one of the questions that keep coming up is, but yes, this is all good, but isn't there a need to have some kind of standard language so that people can understand each other? Don't we need standards? Don't we need still correctness in order to avoid confusion? So how are we able to make sure that, so what are your thoughts on this question of the need for standards, and how does that square with what we're talking about giving the same value to all varieties of English? Anybody has any thoughts? Rosie?
Sure, I'd love to have a crack at answering this one, because it's a question that I get asked all the time as well. And I think often people have this fear that there'll be a type of communication crisis if we kind of allow all varieties to be spoken and documented, and, for example, especially heard on TV and on the news and on the radio. And my response to that is always, people would understand these varieties if they were exposed to them more. I think it's all about exposure. It's really an insult to the intelligence of speakers and listeners to think that we can all only understand one standard. Humans are much more linguistically sophisticated than that, and the majority of people in the world are multilingual, let alone multi-dialectal. And so I think, put those voices in the spotlight and we'll all become more familiar. Communication will become an awful lot smoother, and hopefully some of the prejudice will also diminish.
Yeah. Kelly, did you also want to say something?
Yeah, I think Kingsley had his hand up, but I'll just say really briefly, no. We don't need, the standard is born out of racism and oppression. Do we need racism and oppression? No. That's my short answer. I mean, we certainly need, communication. We certainly need, like rules for how we use language for, like technology and certain things like that, right? To like make machines go, right? But for communication, like with each other, we did that totally fine as a species before we had books, right? We had absolutely no problem of doing that before we even thought of what standards were. And so, no, we don't need them.
Yes. Kingsley, did you want to comment on that as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that the key thing here is prejudice, right? It's we can't rule out the place of standard variety, but speakers and everyone of us should understand that the standard variety is just one variety. Yeah, right up, and that is just privilege. It's just another privilege that one variety has been chosen, right? And to recognize that every variety should be allowed to exist. And I think that's the bottom line. To, as much as possible, avoid prejudicing other varieties because they have not been selected by accidents of history as the standard. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So there are also several questions on sources of evidence, like so there are questions about whether the use of and also the rise of increased communication on the internet, and how's that impacted the way that we research varieties of English and how varieties of English are perceived. So I think I can address those questions in that. No, actually, the internet has, as I've mentioned before, has really revolutionized the way that we can document minoritized varieties of English. It gives us much more evidence to look at. So before we could only rely on printed books and newspapers, magazines, and things like that. But now we have instant access to things like social media posts, song lyrics. So things that are beyond just print sources that traditionally we had to rely on. But I think the only thing that complicates things for us is just the amount of, sometimes it's the amount of information that's available. So there's so much more filtering that needs to happen, to ensure that, so because you go on Twitter, you search for a word and you get a lot of noise. So that would be the only complication. But generally, having the internet and internet language has been a boon for the documentation of minoritized varieties of English. So there have also been questions about how should the OED reconsider its current designation of certain usages as colloquial and slang? So what are your thoughts on, because it often happens that minoritized varieties of English are thought of as just slang. So, for example, African American English is just, it's urban, it's slang, it's rap. How do we, does the panel have any thoughts on the relationship between these varieties um, and slang and colloquial language? I guess I could start in that even varieties of English can have slang. So within a specific variety of English, there are different registers. So varieties is different from a geographical variety is different from registers. The words that are only that are slang or colloquial, but there are also words that can be used in much more formal, in a much more formal variant of the language. I think what we take issue is the thinking that just because you speak, let's say, Philippine English, that means that you're only using the English language colloquially. You can perfectly well use Philippine English to write an academic research article if you wanted to. There used to be, she hasn't updated in a while, but there was a podcast that I was listening to called the Black Language Podcast, and it's very much a linguistics podcast being given by somebody who speaks African American English. It's just there's nothing about any of these varieties that prevents it from being used in different registers. You can use it to chat to your mom. You can use it to give a talk. I mean, just like I'm using now. I'm not consciously trying to speak British English right now. I would say that I'm speaking Philippine English right now in an academic setting, and you can understand me. So I think it's just a matter of misunderstanding the the different labeling here. So when we say slang or colloquial, it's because a word is used only by a specific group of people, in an informal way. But that doesn't have anything to do with whether it's used by people in Africa or in Asia or in any other part of the world.
Yeah,
All right.
just to add a voice to that, Danica. You are talking about now. It's important to make it clear that it is not the OED per se that assigns these labels to these words. What the OED does is to describe the usage. So it's because speakers use such words colloquially. So what the OED just has to describe what is seen, and that's colloquial usage. So it's not necessarily OED are apportioning these labels as they see fit. As they see fit, it is
Yeah,
describing usage in
yeah,
different.
it's a description of usage. Yeah. And there are also very interesting questions about variation within these varieties. So I think that's a very bad question of, so when you say, let's Singapore English, it's not just one monolithic variety either. There is a variation within Singapore English itself. There is a variation within, Malaysian English or within Nigerian English, especially when we're talking about really huge countries with huge populations. Of course, there's going to be regional variations within regional variations. So people are just asking how we address that in the OED. And I was wondering, Catherine, perhaps you have some thoughts because we've had a lot of discussions about about
Yes, I mean, I do. So I do have a little personal experience in that area as the child of a Scots speaker who spoke a variety of Scots Doric from the northeast that was not intelligible to other Scots speakers. Never, so there are absolutely varieties within varieties. I mean, as we would expect if we thought about it for a moment. But when we are making a pronunciation model, there's a real tension between you want to reflect the multiplicity of different phonetic realities that are there. And at the same time, you need to have a model that is helpful, that is actually useful. And so it is a bit of a compromise. And when on the pages where we describe each of our models, and in the conversations that we've had with our different consultants, we're often saying things like, we know that this consonant sometimes is realized a little more like this, a little more like that. We're going to try and use a broad phonemic transcription that lets us kind of put up an umbrella under which most of the ways it might be realized within the variety as we've defined it, that works. One of the beautiful things that we get to do with the pronunciations is we have the transcription, which is broad and phonemic and subject to, you know, the constraints of the model, and we have audio of an actual person saying it. So that's, of course, going to be, you know, you could have many different speakers reading a transcription of something, and they would all be, you know, good renderings of that transcription. But it's a great way to say, here's one of the ways that this might actually sound, and that's one of, I'm really glad that we don't use synthesis in that way. We use actual recordings of people, and we get the people we get into the booths to create the audio are you know, actual speakers of the, and it can be difficult to, I mean, there was one of the questions was about, touched on Irish English. So, and that's an example of an English where there's a great deal, particularly, you know, in Ulster English, the Englishes of the north of the island of Ireland, very different phonetically speaking from what you hear in what I think Hickey calls it the supra-regional southern, the kind of Dublin standard. And that's very difficult because we can't get into all the fine detail that we might wish to when what we're trying to do is say, here's an Irish word, this is how an Irish English speaker might say it. We have to make a little bit of a compromise in order to produce something that's helpful for a lexicographical purpose. But we're really aware of those dimensions underneath it. And yeah, we try and get into it a little bit as much as we can in the models.
Welcome, Jeannette.
Oh, welcome, Jeannette. Glad to have you here again. Back. Perhaps the last question I could answer, because I also want to give some time for everyone to have a final word. Perhaps considering, so someone from the NHS Digital says that they've had a focus on plain language and easy read versions of their content. I think this is a question that's very significant in the times that we're living now. So, so plain language and easy read versions of their content on health and data, but should we more seriously consider minoritized versions of English words in healthcare, considering the diverse origins of people in the UK? And I guess this is not just a question for the UK specifically, but in health communication, how important is it for people to understand this sort of very important public health communications in their own varieties of English rather than in just the standard variety? Anybody has let's say perhaps Kingsley, could you have briefly any thoughts in this question?
Yeah, I was just going to say yes to her last question. Right, but beyond that, yeah, it is important. The world is becoming increasingly globalized and multilingual. For instance, if we take UK, for instance, which the context that the question is coming from, you find that even among the health workers, not just the people who enjoy the services, but even among the health workers, there is an increasing number of speakers of English who are not, people who are not speakers of British variety of English or standard British variety. So this makes it increasingly important for the NHS as a body to consider these varieties of English. Just today I was reading an interesting PhD work on someone who researched on how care homes in the UK provide care to people who are not originally British, people who they are old in terms of cultural sensitivity, which is, I mean, linguistics comes in as well. So I think it's a full package, and the NHS should look into this and be more receptive, so to speak.
Yeah. Thanks, Kingsley. So I do apologize that we don't have here, because we're receiving so many questions, so many interesting questions, and not just questions, but also individual stories of relating to things that have resonated with our audience, that the things that we've discussed today. And also there were some questions that are a bit more technical about how we do things in the OED, which perhaps we don't really have time to discuss now. But I hope, I think when we publish the recording of this session, there's would be an opportunity for us to answer some of those questions, or at least link to places within the Varieties of English page where those questions are answered. But for now, I would just like to wrap up this very fascinating conversation just by asking one final question to each of our panelists. So we all agree that we don't like language prejudice. We don't need it. So what can we do to fight it? What can we do to fight language prejudice? Rosie.
Um,
Sure. I think I'll actually defer to the other panelists on this one, because I answered earlier when I was talking about exposure. I think exposure, hearing those varieties on TV and radio is really the most important way that we can tackle language prejudice. So I'll leave the others to speak.
Okay.
if I may,
Can you?
I would agree. I would agree with that, Rosemary. And I also think that there has to be more. There has to be just more education. People just have to be made more aware, not only within the education system, but publicly, that every language variety is worthy. There's none that is better than the other, because of course the whole question of language and society, language and social class, language and status, etc., is a very strong question, and that has influenced people's attitudes to different language varieties. Hence, the fact that in the Caribbean, the Creole Englishes and the dialects and so on, because they were spoken by people who were demographically in the majority, that is the African slaves that were brought in and were assimilated into the colonies. But then, because they were so, and I regard this as an act of creativity, because they were so creative by being able to forge out of the languages, West African languages in contact with European languages, they were able to forge new varieties, which became the Creoles, and then in some cases the dialects later. That that has to be understood, and that the reason why those varieties were stigmatized was because of the people who spoke them. So I think that there's a lot of sociolinguistic work to do in terms of uh, moving language away from its close ties with class and status, and who is who in the society, and so on, and who has the power, and so on and so forth. And it needs a lot of public education. That's what I would suggest.
Very briefly, what do you think we can do to fight language prejudice?
Myself?
Yes.
All right. So I think researchers have done a lot, and OED has also done a lot of work. But I think that the the greatest challenge we have in this is policy. People who have the power to make policies and change policies. One policy in Nigeria, for instance, by the Ministry of Education recognizing Nigerian English, one statement can do more than 10 years of research. So as linguists, what do? We have been doing the research. We can sponsor campaigns, petitions, social media hashtags, campaigning for the policymakers, and those are the creators of power, to listen to us and to sell this message to them.
Well said. Thank you, Kingsley. Uh, Kelly, what are your what last words would you leave us with? Fighting language prejudice.
Thank you. Yeah, I started out talking about how like language prejudice lives in the mind, right? And so when we think about addressing this, we have to do it individually. We have to do it in our own minds. And so it begins with, individual self-reflexive critique. And it really involves rewiring neurons, right? It involves laying down new patterns of how you're processing language, how you're thinking about how other people are using it in the world. And I'll just say that, every time you do the thing, it matters. That's how language is built. That's how it evolves. Every time you reproduce a pattern, every time you say a word, every time you rebuild a linguistic structure in your mind, that's how language evolves over time. So every time you use a more inclusive pronoun, every time you, code switch and make the language, more inclusive and encourage that change from below, you yourself are resisting and doing the thing, right? So I think just by being who we are challenging language prejudice.
Yeah. Let's do the thing. And Catherine, what's your last thoughts? Just some final thoughts.
Oh gosh, well, I think our way of doing, I mean, you and I particularly, Danica, we're trying to do the thing, or do our little corner of the thing by documenting, by recording, by codifying, by making the OED something that does reflect these varieties of English in a proper way, and setting them alongside. I mean, earlier when people were talking about the moving away from recording standard English, it's the power of and, right? Standard English, British English, American English is still very much being recorded and codified, and other varieties of English that have historically not been recorded and codified alongside them are, the intention is to rectify that, and that's how we fight language prejudice.
Thanks, Catherine. Well, so I guess my co-panelists here have really, said very succinctly the many systemic societal things that we need to do to fight language prejudice. So more exposure, more education, more research, very important policy changes. But also Kelly highlighted what we can do as individuals. And I would like to close with that as well, And so the last word for me would be to just be curious. Because to me, I always find it strange when people say they love language and then they strike me as a very strangely incurious. So that means that they don't love language; they only love their language, and that's not, and that's not how linguists think. What I love about working in a dictionary is that I'm surrounded by linguists and lexicographers who are always curious, and that's the ethos that we always try to maintain in the OED. Because truly loving language is appreciating it in all of its diversity, its flexibility, its creativity. Linguists don't go when they hear something different from what they're used to. Linguists don't go, "Ew, what's that?" They go, "What's that? Well, wonder what that happened." And when they meet someone who speaks differently from them, they don't go. They don't go. "I don't have time for you. You speak differently from me." It's more like, "Oh, this person has had a different experience of language than me. What's their story?" So I think if that's how to truly love language, and if we go about life with that attitude, our experience of language will be so much better. Trust me on that. So that's, I think that's how I would close. So thank you. Thank you so much for speaking of rewarding experiences. Thank you so much, Jeannette, Rosie, Kingsley, Catherine, Kelly. Thank you so much for this wonderful couple of hours talking about these issues with me. I look forward to our continuing collaboration. And thank you so much, everyone in the audience, for joining us and for all of your kind words and your stories that you've shared with us in the chat. And we'll keep on doing the thing. Simone,
thank you very much, everyone. Danica, thank you so much for hosting the panel. And I think everybody in the team will agree with me when I say that we're very honored to be able to gather such a panel here today. I feel very privileged that I was able to be present. And I want to thank everyone for your patience, for the technical difficulties. And for now, thanks again.
And thank you so much. Thank you so much, Simone, and thank you, Joe, for organizing everything. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, and bye, everyone.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you so much.
Mhm. You're welcome.